Give me 30 minutes and I'll give you years of experience to keep your vintage audio equipment operating properly for decades to come. Whether you want to find someone to fix your vintage audio equipment or whether you want to fix it yourself, in this video I'm going to show you how. There's a lot to cover, so let's get started. Such a nice day out, I thought I'd get outside today and talk about where do you get your vintage stereo equipment repaired if you have it. You know, if you got something broke, where do you get it repaired? Or even if it's still working, where do you get it serviced? You'd like to have it looked at. It's 30, 40, 50 years old. You probably got the same issue. Maybe you're lucky enough, you're one of those guys and you've got somebody, you know, a handful of guys around this country that are competent and work on this stuff that you can trust. But if not, what do you do? First thing I would do, if I didn't have anyone to work on my vintage equipment, Google it. Just Google vintage audio repair, Google vintage stereo repair, and just see what you come up with. The second option is to send it off. But really, if you can, fixing it, getting it fixed local is the way to go. If you can't find anybody local to work on it and you don't want to take the risk of shipping the equipment and the expense that goes along with that, then maybe you could attempt to work on it. But the warning I have at the beginning of all of my videos is there for a reason. 99% of you out there understand that this equipment can hurt you. You plug anything into your mains and you're working on it, you can get shocked. Doesn't matter if it's a toaster or a piece of vintage audio equipment, you can get hurt. So if you don't have the basic understanding of safety, then this isn't something you want to do. Fixing any piece of vintage audio equipment, the great thing about that, many people before you have done the same thing. So there's a lot of information out there on the internet, whether it's in audio forums where other people have fixed the exact same unit you have, or if it's finding schematics or service manuals, it's easy to find almost any model. Okay, if you're like most people, you don't have anyone local to fix this for you. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of audio forums out there with some expertise, along with the service manuals being available. So now you got to think, can I get the parts for this stuff? Is it even worth me trying to fix it? Today I'm going to tell you where to get those parts for your vintage audio equipment. You know, I took a look on YouTube and I just did a search about vintage audio parts, vintage stereo parts. I didn't see anybody talking about them at all. And I can't tell you how many times I've been contacted by someone to say, well, you can't get the parts for these anymore, can you? Or where do you get the parts? Or even getting contacted by other technicians that they can't get parts. And I want to tell you that 99% of the parts to repair and restore your vintage stereo equipment is available. It's available online at Mouser.com and also Digikey.com. Those are two big parts houses. If you can't find it at one, you'll find it at another. Do not buy any parts on eBay unless you're very familiar with the seller. I can't believe it. You know, when I hear about counterfeit transistors and counterfeit capacitors, I just can't believe there's a market. I get counterfeit Rolex watches. How's there a market for it? Apparently there is, because there are counterfeits. But Mouser and Digikey are both certified by the manufacturers, guaranteed what you order is what you get. And when I'm talking about the parts, capacitors and the transistors and the diodes and the resistors, most of all that stuff is still available. There's a few exceptions to that, but most of them are still available. The cosmetic parts are the big problem. You can't get those. You can't call Pioneer or Marantz and say, send me a new volume control knob, right? They don't exist. So that's a big problem there to find the cosmetic parts. But as far as the parts to keep the unit running, those are almost all available. Now the knobs are available on the internet, like eBay, places like that, but you're not going to get it from one of the part houses like Mouser or Digikey. And as I said, most of the parts are available, but I have a couple units where parts are nearly impossible to find except again from a donor unit or from eBay, and that's my Pioneer SX1980. The output transistors are not easily obtained. Again, you're not ordering those from Mauser or DigiKey. Along with that's my Marantz 2500, which has a little bit of a reputation of having power transformer issues, and even more so in the 2600, but if that fails, you've basically got yourself a doorstop or a boat anchor. Most of y'all probably have what you need to work on vintage audio equipment, a variety of screwdrivers. You need a small set of needle nose pliers. You need a small wire cutter, something that's appropriate for the size of the wires that are in these units. Probably the most important thing I've found that you need is a good Allen wrench set or a hex set, both metric and SAE. And the last thing you want to do is strip one of those screws, one of those small screws inside your volume control or your bass control. The minimal you need for test equipment is a digital multimeter. If you don't have one, you must have one. If you have one, you're halfway home. You can fix many problems with that, but without a digital multimeter, it'll be practically impossible to repair any of these units. You don't need anything high-end. Go to Amazon, Google digital multimeters. $30, $40 meter is going to be fine. You don't have to spend $500 or $1,000 on some professional model. Just a $30, $40 one and you'll be good to go. But just don't get one of these $3 ones at the flea market or Harbor Freight. You'll need a soldering iron and solder. Once again, you don't need to go out and spend hundreds of dollars on an iron if you don't want to. You can get a good soldering iron, $20, $30, $40 again. And the best way is, as I just mentioned with the multimeter, get on Amazon, just do a search, see what people say about the different models. Another mandatory item to have on your bench is some sort of a contact cleaner. I use Diodes brand products, but there's many different ones out there. Use several different ones. As I said, I've got the liquid variety also of them. Those are used in some spots, but I don't think you can go wrong. I guess if you're going to just buy one spray, the D5 is the spray. If you're going to buy two, get some F5 too. An oscilloscope and a signal generator will go a long way to help you in your troubleshooting, and frankly, that's about all you'll ever need. If you have a digital multimeter, an oscilloscope, and a signal generator, you're set to go to fix almost any issue with vintage audio equipment. The oscilloscope, you really don't need anything special. Pretty much any oscilloscope that's been manufactured in the last 50 years would work great for troubleshooting vintage audio equipment. An old Tektronix, an old B&K, an old HP, whatever you can find. If it's got 2 channels, you're probably good to go. And the signal generator, I have a more modern signal generator, a digital generator, but some people use their iPhone. They put an app on their iPhone and they put a signal into the equipment. Another tool that comes in so handy is a desoldering tool. Now, you guys that are just starting out, you might think, well, you know, I don't really need that, and you don't, and I wouldn't recommend it. I'd get that digital multimeter, I'd get that soldering iron, I'd even get the old oscilloscope, you know, a signal generator before I got a desoldering iron, because they're pretty expensive. I have a Hacko desoldering iron, but if you ever do a restoration, you'll never do one without one. Boy, is it easy. Works so well that you'll never go back to anything else. But they're pretty expensive. They're going to run you around $300 or give or take a little bit. I'm going to talk about repairing vintage audio equipment for those of you who don't have the expertise to read a schematic well. There's some techniques and tips I'll show you that you can use that may help you when you're repairing a piece of vintage audio gear and you don't have that expertise to understand how every circuit works. The first thing that you should do is to go to HiFiEngine.com and download the service manual for your particular piece of equipment. Experience is the #1 thing that you'll find that you need to work on vintage audio equipment. One thing that you can do is just take a look at your piece of equipment. I had a Sony, and still do have the same Sony, TAF6B. They are known, they're a great little amplifier first of all, but they are known to have a lot of power supply problems. And if you take a look, they're in a sealed unit. I mean, imagine how hot that gets. It's under a lot of stress anyway. You first take a look. This unit would not power up. It would click a little bit. You know, you'd hear a little click, 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 click. You know, it would just keep clicking. And so I did a little research, found out, as I just said, there's a lot of power supply issues. Well, I didn't need really anything. I didn't need a meter, I didn't need a scope, I didn't need any piece of equipment other than my eyes. What had happened is one of those electrolytic capacitors that I harp on and harp on and harp on did blow up, blew off a piece of artwork, took out a transistor with it, and I can't remember what else. Had to repair the artwork with a wire, had to replace the transistor, repaired the 40-year-old capacitor that should have been gone 20 years ago, and guess what? It powered up. So here, that's just an example of how you could repair something with no test equipment. Here's another example, my Pioneer A27 integrated amplifier. Take a look at this filter capacitor. You don't need any equipment to tell you something's wrong there. Who knows how many years that'd been going on. It probably didn't just happen. Been going on for, we'll never know. Years, probably. And it had started dripping its toxic mess down into the chassis all over everything. Now, you didn't need any equipment. I didn't need a meter, I didn't need a scope, I didn't need anything. I just needed to take the bottom cover off and take a look. But this, again, is another reason why I harp on those electrolytic capacitors. They do go bad, and the manufacturer of these filter capacitors say you got 15 to 20 years. They were in their 40. You're lucky something worse didn't happen as far as I'm concerned. So again, this is another way you can just take a look to find a problem. You can use a digital multimeter to test the DC offset at the speaker outputs. You don't even have to remove the cover of a receiver or amplifier, and it just kind of gives you a general health. It's certainly not the end all, but it gives you something. It's simple, it's easy, and it's something that you should do. So you're looking for close to 0 DC volts at the speaker outputs as you can get, and normally you're going to have something under 50 millivolts. Some people say that's too much, some people say that's not too bad. Closer to 0 the better. You get up in the 100 millivolt range, that's something you're probably going to start to hear, possibly, at least in the bass region. So this gives you a quick little test. If you've got 400 or 500 millivolts out there, it's something to maybe be concerned with. It doesn't mean it's a terrible issue, but it's just a real quick and easy test that you can do in 5 minutes. So that's something you can do with a multimeter. Another common problem that you can use a digital multimeter to help you with in vintage audio equipment are those units that power up, you hit the power button, on they come, but there's no sound. In many pieces of vintage audio equipment, they use a protection relay to protect your speakers from excess DC voltage getting to them and damaging them. So many times when you have a piece of equipment that powers up and you don't hear that relay click, normally it's one of the power amp assemblies that are sending excessive DC voltage up to your protection board. It can be the protection board too, and it can be that relay that's on these protection boards. They go bad also. But with that digital multimeter, you can narrow down a problem significantly. So you can narrow that down to just one particular area of your vintage equipment. So if you go up there and measure, and let's say you got 5 volts DC, well, that's why your protection relay is not operating to the speakers, why it's protecting the speakers from that excess DC voltage. And that's another easy way to use a DC voltmeter to see what an issue is with a piece of vintage audio equipment. That's fairly easy to do. Now I'll talk about how you can use an oscilloscope and a signal generator to help you troubleshoot a problem with your vintage audio equipment, even if you cannot read a schematic well. The great thing about Stereo equipment is what? You've got 2 channels, so isn't that nice? And if you've got trouble with one channel and the other channel works, well, you've got a helper right there with you, and that's the other channel. Even though the schematics, and hopefully you've downloaded the schematic for your piece of equipment, most of the time they do a pretty good job about giving you voltages at certain spots, signals at certain pictures of signals at certain spots, so it helps you troubleshoot it. But really, when you're inexperienced, your best helper is that other channel. So if you've got 24 volts, let's say at this pin, and you're not sure if that's right or not, if you go over to the other channel and it's 24 volts, then you feel pretty good, that's not the problem, and you keep moving on. Really, for this, you do need an oscilloscope. And you do need a signal generator, because if you just got music going, you're not going to be able to tell what's going on. You need a signal generator that can produce one frequency consistently so you can watch it go through. As I said, the great thing is with 2 channels, so let's say you've got a receiver. I spoke of a preamplifier and amplifier, but let's say you've got a receiver. First of all, and you think you've lost one channel, so let's say your left channel is bad. First of all, you've got to figure out, is it all the inputs? So, you hit FM, yeah, my left channel's still out. I hit phono, still my left channel's out. Aux, still my left channel's out. Well, then you can be pretty sure it's not the FM section or the phono, because your channel's out in all of them. So it's either in your amplifier section or preamp. When you're actually inside the unit and troubleshooting an issue, you've got to be very careful of not shorting leads together. You also got to be careful for your own safety, as I mentioned before. If you're new at this, you're going to make mistakes. Even if you're not new at it, you're going to make mistakes. So now you can take those 2 leads from the scope. We know we've got a problem on one channel, and you can get one probe on one channel, the other probe on the other channel, and compare them. It's great. You've got the best helper ever. There's nobody who knows this stuff better than the other channel, right? So you can compare signals, and if you see a difference, even if you don't understand what you're seeing, you know it's different. And then you can work your way back to where they're the same. You'll be able to narrow down a problem instead of, when you first open these pieces of equipment up, if you haven't before, it's going to be daunting. You're just going to look at it and go, where do I even start? But just take it a block at a time and narrow it down, and you'll find that with experience, as I mentioned before, it gets easier and easier. And that's the whole key. I think most people that work on this stuff, they'll tell you that you'll have certain projects that are very, very difficult, but over time, you gain more experience and it gets easier. Now I'll show you how to get those cosmetic knobs off the front of your vintage audio equipment. This is a Sansui AU9900 integrated amplifier, but they all are similar. The best way is, again, with this on its left side, right? This is a lot easier than this being flat down. We could move this guy down flat, but then what? Then we got to try to get under it. So this is like perfect for us. So let me show you how to get those loose. Some of the switches, like this one here, which is the tuner switch on the far right of the faceplate, you can tell he's not attached with anything. So he'll pull straight off for you. Now let me show you one where we have to use our hex tool on these guys. This is a standard hex tool. So first way you want to try it, just to make it easier on you, right, is do it the long way. Right? Just hold this guy here and try to turn it. In this guy's case, he came loose. Now, you don't want to force this. If you're having to bend this thing like crazy on the long side, again, I got this on the long side, then you need to turn the tool around to the short side, because that'll give you a lot more leverage and you've got a lot less chance of stripping that screw. So I'll just show you. We put it in that way now. Right? And you got more leverage to get. Some of these are going to be stubborn. This one wasn't. So, it turns extremely easy that way. So I was able to just come here and make it easier on me, because when you're in here on the short side, what do you got to be worried about a little bit too? You have no room here if you're having to crank this. In this one's case, it wouldn't be a big deal, but that can happen. So I'll just As I said, I got the long end in, and I'm just going to turn it counterclockwise. And you just got to turn a little bit, and you can see it move, right? And off she comes. Today I want to talk about electrolytic capacitors in vintage audio equipment and whether you should change them or you shouldn't change them or you should change some of them. Just generally out there on the internet, there's all types of different positions. The one thing that I see missing out there, whether you're for it or against it, it's a lot of personal opinion. It's my technician said, it's in my experience, it's all these things that have some validity, but in today's world, you can go right to the manufacturer's websites and they'll tell you all about the design of them, the testing and validation of them, and the reliability of them. You don't have to go to some forum and some guy says do it or don't. Go to the manufacturer. And if you Google electrolytic capacitor lifespan, you'll come up with all the manufacturers and also some of the part suppliers that provide links. Like here I show a link to Illinois Capacitor and gives you a little idea of what they're going to talk about. These are the people that are the experts. And here I show a link from Mauser, a big parts house, but to Elna. They were a big supplier of capacitors in the 60s, 70s, and 80s for Japanese vintage equipment. They'll tell you everything you wanted to know and even more. Probably more than you wanted to know. Some basic things like this. These are 3 pages out of hundreds on just talking about the reliability. Here's Illinois Capacitor, giving you a little brief 2-page. Here, we condensed it. This is kind of like electrolytic capacitors for dummies. They've taken hundreds of pages, and fortunately, somebody wrote it in a way that you can understand it. You can believe the manufacturers or not. That's up to you guys out there. Electrolytic capacitors are the #1 failure point in any vintage audio equipment. Now I'm going to show you a little bit about how to choose an electrolytic capacitor that's appropriate for a circuit. Here I show a schematic. This is a schematic of a Pioneer SX1050 receiver. Take a look at pin 6 near the top, 76 volts. And pin 8, which is 24 volts, and notice the capacitors off of those pins. One's a 2200 25 volt off the 24 volt pin, and the other's a 470 80 volt off the 76 volt pin. That's pretty tight, right? Pioneer, in this case, and all the other manufacturers, they saved money. You save pennies and you make tens of thousands of units. You save a lot of money. What I ended up doing is taking the 25 volt capacitor and upgrading it to a 50. And I also took the 80 volt up to 100. Of course, the same microfarads, 2200 and 470. But just a few pennies more, these data sheets on these manufacturers' websites, if you want to know the difference, they'll say if you lower it 10 degrees Celsius, this is what happens to the reliability of that capacitor. If you run this capacitor 20% under voltage it's rated, here's what you can expect. But if you look at all the parameters, all of the manufacturers, basically what they're going to tell you is you're probably going to get 15 to 20 years out of these capacitors and have them still meet their original specs. You can probably see I'm kind of in the camp of changing out old electrolytic capacitors. Hard to argue from my standpoint with the people who manufacture the product, who design the product, who test and validate the product. All the information in today's world, it's great. It's all online. 40 years ago, 30 years ago, you wouldn't have been able to get this. Go to Google. You can find out everything you ever wanted to know and a lot of stuff you probably didn't want to know about the reliability and the longevity of electrolytic capacitors. Some diodes have an issue, such as the ones in my Sansui BA5000 power amplifier. And I mentioned diodes on this board. And this board, by the way, is attached to the back of the meters. Comes right off, a couple screws, and you can bring it to your test bench. These little green and black, you see kind of like right at the front of the board, I'm holding it. Those little diodes have a history of failing. You know, many BA5000s have flaky meter issues, and this is a leading cause why. They just, you know, after 45 years, they've gained a reputation to fail quite often. So a lot of times you don't change diodes out, but these you do. In this diode's case, I combined, for the replacement, I combined two modern diodes to make an equivalent diode. There are several issues also with transistors in vintage audio equipment. Some have reputations of failing, some have reputations of getting noisy, and some have just had a very hard life over 40 years, like regulators and power supplies. This vintage Marantz 2270 has the notorious 2SC458 in it, and those just have to be replaced on site. It's impossible to go through every combination of bad transistors you may run into when you're working on your piece of vintage audio equipment. Remember, Google's your friend. Before you start working on your piece of equipment, Google that model and find out the issues that you're going to have when you start to work on it. I didn't mention tuners or the tuner section of receivers, but they also have components that fail, just like any other part of a piece of vintage audio equipment. But to align them, you may have heard of people talking about tuner alignment and that type of thing. You need some specialized equipment. It's not a big deal, but again, it's one of those tools that you need if you want to align them. Now, I haven't mentioned tape decks at all. And of course, in any tape deck, whether it's a cassette deck, an open reel deck, a digital audio tape deck, L-cassette deck, it doesn't matter. They all have transistors and capacitors and diodes, etc., just like any other piece of electronics like we've been talking about. But with those pieces of equipment, you have the mechanical side of it. And any tape deck you'll find, if you work on them, as I said, I didn't mention those a whole lot. A lot of times in tape decks, it's not just the electrical issues you have, but it's the mechanical. That old grease that's 40, 50 years old, it's hardened, and you've got to disassemble these tape decks most of the time to clean that old grease out and get new grease in there. And there's a lot of small parts in both cassette decks, open reel decks, etc. It's a whole nother challenge. You can do it. There's no doubt about it. I do it. Look at me. I'm not all that bright. You can tell that. And I'm able to get them apart and back together most of the time. But that is one more challenge. And all I can say about tape decks, take a look at my videos, other people's videos. In my videos, I try to make it clear you got to be organized. There's so many little parts in both cassette and open reel decks that you don't even, sometimes something falls, you don't even know you have it. A little nylon washer. And you think, well, I don't know, how big a deal can it be? Well, in a tape deck, it's usually a big deal. In a piece of electronics, you know, like if you've got your amplifier and preamplifier, let's say you lose a washer that holds one of your circuit boards. I don't think that's good, but it's not going to make a difference in how it operates. If you lose a little washer in your cassette or open reel deck, it's going to make a difference, most likely. So you have to be very organized and take it one step at a time. In addition, there's a lot of specialized equipment that really helps you out with tape decks. I have some of it, and it really makes the job easier to figure out how to operate something, how to adjust something, and when you adjust it, be able to get it correct. There's service manuals available for tape decks, just like there are the rest of the equipment. It's just a little bit more involved, and you need some specialized test equipment that you may not have with tape decks. So doing head alignments and this type of thing, you just can't do it by sight. You can't turn a screw and say, well, I think I got the head aligned correctly. It doesn't work that way. You start doing that, you get yourself in a lot of trouble. But as far as the electronics go, it's no different than any other piece of equipment. As the years go on, more and more pieces of vintage audio equipment are failing. They're just getting older. And as time goes on, many of the technicians who worked on this equipment are getting older also, and they're moving on. So in that spirit, I produced this video because this will help somebody in 2020. If this video is still up on YouTube in 2030, 2040, it'll still help them out. And I would love to see this equipment continue on for another 30, 40, or 50 years, because with service, I believe many of them will celebrate their 100th birthday. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a big thumbs up down below. For you non-subscribers, if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. And to my present subscribers, what can I say? Thank you so much. You all have a good day.